Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Today we are going to be doing a short little follow-up to our one of our SPA demos where we were talking about promises and loading things in, and we probably should actually talk about what a promise is in JavaScript and how we can use them in React. So I will have some reading materials for you on this topic outside of it. It's basically this Mozilla page, which is a really good explanation. But the idea is we are getting an asynchronous call with our websites. And what that means basically is that we are going to load in some content, but we have a dependency on something else. Maybe we're loading in JSON data, maybe we're loading in something from a database. Basically, I need to fill a container with some sort of information. So I need to make a call, and we've done that with things like Axios and Fetch and whatnot. But because we are reaching out on a network connection, we are not guaranteed the answer immediately, right? We are going to make that API call, and then we have to wait for the request to be fulfilled. And that might be instantaneously. It might take seconds to minutes, depending on what you're bringing in. So our code needs to handle that appropriately. We can't just act on data that doesn't exist. And that's kind of the idea with this asynchronous type of loading. Now, the promise mechanism is pretty common across languages. In Python, we have the coroutines or the async and await decorators, depending on which version of Python you're using. But basically, you're just saying this particular function that you're calling is not going to have its data right away. We need to wait until it's finished. Okay? So with the promise, basically what we'll be doing, and I'm going to kind of abstract this a little bit, and then I'll show you some code and a little tutorial in a moment. But the idea is that you create a promise object in JavaScript, and this is, something that is baked in. And we are going to basically run our call, and then once that is done, act on that data. If there was an error, act on the error. So what this typically looks like is that we will have a promise with a dot then kind of tacking on that function call. So it's like if I had a promise called, lowercase promise, I would say dot then call a function or do something once this thing is completed. So here's an example of a promise from the Mozilla page. Basically, I could define a promise to have a resolution or a rejection callback function, and we're going to assume that we are going to do resolution function with 777 here. So this is basically going to be our function that we're handling here. So once we define this particular object, we call promise a dot then. So basically we are expecting this resolution function to execute. So if we have this particular value, and we can actually go ahead and let's drop this into CodePen. I'm blocking part of it with my massive head. So here is our application. Let's go ahead and check our console. We see immediate logging, deferred logging, basically. Asynchronous logging has val 777. Now, we would probably have something like a delay in here or a timeout or something of that nature, but basically the idea is wait for something to occur, and anything that depends on this value should take place either inside of this then or after the then is checked, or put a dummy value in there and then fill it in afterwards with some DOM manipulation. It's like doing the document.get element by ID, div ID dot HTML, whatever this content is. Hopefully this idea makes sense. Basically asynchronous logging. Now, I will let you kind of read through this, but I wanted to do a quick little demo for how to use this in React. Now, we did this kind of automatically with our lazy loading and with our infinite scroller application, but I didn't really talk to it. So here is a few examples where it's going to use promises. It's also going to use the suspense module, which is just one way to kind of render out React fully a loading message, so like the little dot dot dots, or put a GIF in there of something spinning, whatever you want to render. So here is a typical React application that is using promises. Now this bit is not using the suspense package, but basically here is the promise portion of this particular application. So I'm going to load something at a particular point in time. And basically all we're doing here is defining a promise which is going to run after 4 seconds, or 4,000 milliseconds here. And all we're doing really is, setting a state variable to true, and then we're going to resolve it. Now, this show is going to be down here. What we would actually have if we were to run this, so I'm just going to go ahead and drop this in verbatim into my existing app here. So let's export defaults. Oh, that's already exported at the top. You can either do it up here or down at the bottom like we've been doing. This way is perfectly fine. Error with app. Can it resolve styles? Okay, let's get rid of the styles. Okay. So we have nothing. Well, okay, let's refresh that. I was impatient. 4-second delay. Okay, so pops in, no warning to the user. It just kind of exists after a set amount of time. And the user visits your site. Why the heck does it sync so slow? Is my network bad? Is something wrong? Oh, here it is, right? So a suspense is going to load in that little dot 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 message. But again, the point here really is if you want to get a feel for how promises work in React, this is kind of a nice way to go ahead and get that set up. So, let's have our specific syntax for creating the promise. So we're going to create a const variable, designate it as async. Again, this is our arrow function, where inside of here, we have a promise. There's our resolve and reject calls. Again, that matches up with what we have for promise syntax out of Mozilla. All right, so new promise, resolve, reject, same thing here. And what we're going to do inside of this is just set a timeout to, update a state variable and have a trigger after 4 seconds. And then we're going to add in the last bit to await. This async await is also important because otherwise JavaScript and React are just going to think this is a straight up normal const. Otherwise, it needs to be there basically to designate it as asynchronous. Okay, one other thing in here too. So this React.useEffect, this is another React thing where it's typically used for side bits of execution for components, typically used for timeouts, updating the DOM, things of that nature. And what we're doing here is we're basically just saying load app, which is our promise. Now I've got a link to the W3 schools for useEffect in case you want a bit more detail here. Basically, yeah, fetching data, updating the DOM timers. So this example, just straight up useEffect. So here is our basic imports. Our React component here is called timer, and then it's just going to update a counter every 1,000 milliseconds. And it's going to basically render out a H1. If you were to run this, we get, this timer being updated. Again, it's just a fancy way of having an extra function be called. This one's being called every 1 second. But again, I'll put the links in there for you to kind of peruse offline. So this the suspense bit to just kind of help out with this loading issue. We could give our app a wait state. So I'm just going to replace everything just to avoid any syntax errors. But basically what we've got going on here is we are adding in a flag. If this state variable show is false, show loading, otherwise return the thing that we want to see. Basically just a simple flag here. Right, so just for funsies, let's see if just copying that is going to work. Basically, we are saying, here's our show. Once our promise is done, set show to true. Initially, it's false. If it's false, return loading, otherwise return true. So let's go ahead and refresh. Okay, so there's my loading. Should become, there we go. So at this point, we have a basic loading message popping in. If you wanted to take this example further, you could add in the suspense package and kind of step through the different states of your promise chain, whether it's pending or it's errored or it's complete. The rest of this tutorial kind of walks you through it bit by bit, and honestly, I'd recommend kind of following it through to see how much extra complexity can be added in just to handle the different states of this promise. Because again, the whole idea here is that I don't want to have dependencies on data that hasn't materialized yet. Another example to kind of make you think about why this is important is that maybe it's not just raw text. Maybe you're getting data that your program needs to act upon. For instance, if you are writing a multiplayer game and your server is hosting all of the important position information for all of your players, all right? Your client side application, so our little front-end React application, requests the state from the server via a promise, and then your React app has to wait for the server to package that data up and send it back, at which point you would maybe calculate physics-related actions. Maybe you have to draw players at certain points of the map. The idea is you're working on some sort of data, and if that doesn't exist, bad things can happen to your various variables, right? We never work with data where we don't know what's inside of it. Goes back to the always initialize your variables concept. Anyway, this video has probably gone on long enough. I will let you play through this tutorial. Again, I highly recommend checking it out. Definitely read through the Mozilla page on promises because it will, it'll go into a lot more detail than just the basics of this is an asynchronous thing, right? Anyway, have fun with that. I will see you all next time. Bye, everybody.